The millionaire promised to take care of the pregnant maid, but hid from her that he was on the verge of bankruptcy. The metallic sound of the telephone echoed across the roof of the Parker Enterprises office, where Nicholas Parker stared at the computer screen with his eyes fixed on the red numbers that seemed to mock him. Another default notice was flashing in his inbox. 35 years old, and with the company on the brink of collapse, he had never imagined that his green technology investment empire would come to this. "Mr. Parker, Miss Rodriguez is here for the 2 o'clock meeting," his assistant announced over the intercom line. Julia Rodriguez. The name made Nicholas straighten up in his leather chair. She was the brilliant software developer his company had hired 6 months ago, responsible for a revolutionary energy optimization project that could be their last hope of financial salvation. "Send her in, Caroline," she replied, quickly adjusting her navy blue tie. The door opened and Julia entered, her hesitant steps contrasting with her usual confidence. Her long dark hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a briefcase to her chest. Nicholas immediately realized that something was wrong. "Julia, is everything all right?" he asked, rising from his chair. She took a deep breath, her brown eyes meeting his. "Nicholas, I need to tell you something important." The office on the 20th floor offered a panoramic view of Seattle, but at that moment, the world outside seemed to have disappeared. Julia sat in the chair opposite his desk, her hands still shaking. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And before you ask, yes, it's from that night after the project launch party." The memory of that night flooded Nicholas' mind. The champagne, the celebration of the new contract, the undeniable chemistry between them that had finally boiled over after months of restrained tension. A night that should have remained a sweet memory was now turning into something much bigger. "I understand if you want to distance yourself," Julia continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." Nicholas stood up again, stepping around the table to approach her. His heart was racing, torn between fear of his company's uncertain future and a sudden surge of protectiveness for Julia and the child she was carrying. "I won't distance myself," he declared firmly, kneeling down beside her. "I'll be by your side every step of the way." The tears Julia had been holding back finally rolled down her face. "You don't have to do this." "I want to," he replied, holding her hands. What he didn't say was that his company was sinking into debt, that investors were abandoning ship, that in a matter of months it could all fall apart. In the weeks that followed, Nicholas found himself immersed in a frantic routine. During the day, he struggled to keep his company afloat, juggling creditors and desperately seeking new investors. In the evenings, he accompanied Julia to her doctor's appointments, decorated a baby's room in her apartment in Queen Anne, and gradually found himself more and more involved not just with the idea of being a father, but with Julia herself. On a particularly tense afternoon, as they walked through Kerry Park overlooking the Space Needle, Julia shared her fears about being a single mother. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll be able to do it," she confessed, her hands resting on the small curve that was beginning to form in her belly. Nicholas stopped, turning to look at her. The setting sun painted the sky orange, creating a golden glow around her. "You're not alone in this," he said, struggling with the weight of guilt over his financial secrets. The phone in his pocket vibrated, probably another charge, but he ignored it. Instead, he pulled Julia close, wrapping her in a protective embrace. She fit perfectly in his arms, as if this was her natural place. "I promise I'll take care of you both," he murmured against her hair, knowing that this promise could become impossible to keep if his financial situation didn't improve quickly. Julia pulled away slightly, looking into his eyes with an intensity that completely disarmed him. "Why are you doing all this, Nicholas? Is it just because of the baby?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. Nicholas knew he was falling in love with her, that his feelings went far beyond a sense of responsibility. But how could he confess this when his life was about to fall apart? "You're important to me, Julia," he finally replied, choosing his words carefully. "We both are." A smile lit up her face, but Nicholas felt his heart squeeze. Every day that passed without revealing the truth about his financial situation was another day of building happiness on fragile foundations. The fear of losing not only his company, but also the chance to have a family with Julia, began to consume him. As they walked back to the car, Nicholas made a silent promise to himself. He would find a way to save his company and protect his new family, even if it meant risking everything he had. What he didn't yet know was that his choices would lead him down a path far more complicated than he could have imagined, where love, loyalty, and truth would be tested beyond their limits. Night was falling over Seattle, and with it, the weight of promises made and secrets kept was becoming increasingly difficult to carry. Nicholas Parker was about to discover that sometimes, trying to protect the ones you love with lies can be the shortest way to losing them forever. Nicholas' fingers drummed nervously on the mahogany table during the board meeting. The PowerPoint projected on the wall showed descending graphs that seemed to mock his attempts to keep his composure. Around them, the board members exchanged worried glances. "The numbers don't lie, Mr. Parker," declared Richard Bennett, one of the older investors, adjusting his gold-framed glasses. "We need a concrete solution by the end of the month. We'll have to consider drastic measures." Nicholas knew exactly what drastic measures meant: selling the company for a fraction of its real value. Julia's project was his last hope, but it still needed at least 3 months to be ready for presentation. "The Rodriguez project is progressing beyond expectations," Nicholas replied, keeping his voice steady. "If we can extend the deadline—" "There are no more deadlines to extend," interrupted Bennett, abruptly closing his leather briefcase. "You have a week to come up with a viable plan." As soon as the meeting room emptied, Nicholas loosened his tie and let out a heavy sigh. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Julia with a photo of the latest ultrasound. His heart squeezed as he saw the small shape outlined in the black and white image. "It's a girl," the message said, followed by a heart. "A daughter." Nicholas sat down heavily in his chair, the reality of his responsibilities weighing even more heavily on his shoulders. How could he tell Julia that the whole future he was promising could fall apart in a matter of days? The sound of soft knocks on the door brought him back to reality. Caroline, his assistant, entered with a worried expression. "Mr. Parker, Ms. Rodriguez is here. She said she has some updates on the project to discuss." Nicholas straightened up quickly, trying to recompose his expression. "You can send her in." Julia entered the room, radiant as the Seattle sun on a rare cloudless day. Her face had that characteristic glow of pregnancy, and she carried her laptop with obvious enthusiasm. "Nicholas, you won't believe it. I've made a significant breakthrough in the optimization algorithm," she exclaimed, taking a seat in front of him. "If we keep going at this pace, we could have a working prototype sooner rather than later." Her enthusiasm was contagious, but every word was like a tiny needle in his heart. "That's wonderful," she replied, trying to smile. Julia stopped typing on her laptop and looked at him with concern. "Are you all right? You look tense." "Just tired," he lied, getting up to approach the window. The city stretched out below them, a maze of buildings and streets that seemed as complex as their current situation. "Shall we have dinner tonight?" suggested Julia, approaching him. "We can celebrate the news of the baby. I still can't believe it's a girl." Nicholas turned to her, momentarily allowing himself to get lost in her hopeful eyes. "Of course," he replied, making an impulsive decision. "In fact, how about we go up to Vancouver for the weekend? We could take a little trip, just the two of us." Julia's face lit up. "Really? That would be perfect. I've always wanted to see Vancouver." While Julia talked excitedly about the plans for the trip, Nicholas formulated a desperate plan in his mind. There was a potential Canadian investor who could perhaps be his salvation. If he could arrange a meeting during the trip. "Nicholas?" Julia's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you really listening?" He held her hands, feeling the comforting warmth of her touch. "Sorry, I got lost in thought. I was thinking about how beautiful you'll look with our daughter in your arms." Julia's smile completely disarmed him. She moved closer, resting her head on his chest. "Sometimes I still wonder how we got here. From one unexpected night to this." This was a word that carried so much meaning. For Julia, it meant the promise of a family, a future together. For Nicholas, it was a painful reminder of everything he could lose. "Julia," he began, gathering the courage to finally tell her the truth. But when she lifted her face to look at him, her smile full of trust and love, the words died in his throat. "Yes, he hesitated, then changed direction. "I'll do my best to be the father our daughter deserves." Julia stood on tiptoe and kissed him softly. "You're already so much more than I could have hoped for." Her every word of reassurance was like an additional weight on his conscience. As he hugged her, Nicholas knew he was running out of time. The weekend in Vancouver would be his last chance to save not only his company, but also the future he was beginning to build with Julia. The afternoon was advancing over Seattle, and the shadows of the skyscrapers stretched like dark fingers over the city. On the rooftop of Parker Enterprises, a man struggled with the weight of his choices, while a woman dreamed of a future that might be more fragile than she imagined. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, as if nature itself was trying to soften the shadows that were gathering around them. Nicholas Parker knew he was walking a fine line between protection and betrayal, and that he would soon have to choose between saving his company or preserving the trust of the woman who had unwittingly become the center of his world. The luxurious Fairmont Pacific Rim in Vancouver glowed against the night sky as Nicholas guided Julia through the marble lobby. He had booked a suite overlooking the harbor, but his thoughts were fixed on the meeting scheduled for the next morning with Marcus Donovan, an investor known for rescuing companies from the brink of bankruptcy for a price. "This place is incredible," Julia whispered, her eyes roaming over the architectural details of the hotel. "It must have cost a fortune." Nicholas felt a tightening in his chest. The credit card used for the reservation was almost maxed out, but he had to keep up appearances. "You deserve the best," he replied, kissing her temple. After settling into their room, Julia fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the trip. Nicholas stayed awake, sitting in the armchair next to the panoramic window, obsessively reviewing the financial projections on his laptop. The numbers danced before his eyes, refusing to make sense. His cell phone vibrated with a message from Caroline. "Mr. Bennett called again. He's demanding an emergency meeting on Monday." Nicholas ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion. The meeting with Donovan had to work. It was his last chance. The next morning, while Julia was still asleep, Nicholas left a fond note on her pillow. "I've gone for a morning walk to see the city. I'll be back soon with breakfast. Love you." The last 3 words slipped out without him realizing it. It was the first time he had written them to her. He hesitated for a moment, but decided to leave them there. The restaurant at the Hotel Georgia was practically empty when Nicholas arrived for the meeting. Marcus Donovan was already waiting for him, impeccable in his Italian suit, fingers drumming on a cup of espresso. "Mr. Parker," Donovan greeted with a calculated smile. "I must admit I was intrigued by your proposal. Parker Enterprises has an impressive reputation in the green technology sector." It did, Nicholas thought bitterly, but kept his professional countenance. "Mr. Donovan, thank you for seeing me. As I mentioned, we're looking for a strategic partnership to expand our operations." "Let's be direct," Donovan interrupted, his icy blue eyes fixed on Nicholas. "I know your company is sinking, but I also know about the Rodriguez project. My analysts predict extraordinary potential." Nicholas' heart raced. "So you're interested in investing?" "I'm interested in buying 70% of the shares, total control over the Rodriguez project. You keep 30% and an executive position, but under my direction." The proposal hit Nicholas like a punch in the gut. The project is the intellectual property of the developer, Julia Rodriguez. She would need to agree to any change of control. Donovan smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Then I suggest you convince her. My offer is valid for 48 hours. After that, well, I hear several creditors are losing patience." Nicholas returned to the hotel, feeling nauseous. He found Julia on the balcony of the suite, admiring the view of the harbor with one hand resting on her stomach. "Hey, sleepyhead," he forced a smile, hugging her from behind. "Was your walk good?" she asked, turning in his arms. "I saw your note. I love you too." Her words hit him with full force, mixing joy and guilt in devastating proportions. "Julia," he began, deciding it was time for the truth. We need to talk about something important. Just then, her cell phone rang. It was from the office in Seattle. It's Ryan from the development team, she said, frowning at the screen. Sorry, I need to take this. Nicholas watched as she talked, her animated gestures indicating good news. When she hung up, her eyes were shining with excitement. Nicholas, we did it. The main algorithm is working perfectly in preliminary tests. We can have a working prototype in 6 weeks, not 3 months. Her enthusiasm was like a knife in his heart. 6 weeks was way beyond the deadline Bennett had given, and Donovan's proposal would mean essentially stealing the project from her. That's wonderful, she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly. Julia noticed his hesitation. What? You've been acting strange ever since he got back. What did you want to tell me? Nicholas looked at her face full of love and trust, at the small curve of her belly where their daughter was growing. How could he destroy all that? I just wanted to say, he paused, his heart fighting a battle between truth and protection, that I'm proud of you, of the project, of everything. Her smile lit up the room, but for Nicholas, the walls seemed to be closing in. He had 48 hours to make a decision that would change their lives forever. As they walked through the city that afternoon, visiting Stanley Park and crossing the Capilano Suspension Bridge, Nicholas felt every moment of happiness like an hourglass draining its last grains of sand. Julia entwined her fingers in his, sharing dreams about the future, completely oblivious to the whirlwind in his mind. The sun was beginning to set over Vancouver, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. On the observation deck of the suspension bridge, Julia leaned on Nicholas' chest, sighing contentedly. This weekend has been perfect, she murmured, like it's the start of something even bigger. Nicholas hugged her tighter, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. In his pocket, his cell phone vibrated with another message from Caroline about yet another billing notification. Time was running out, and he had to choose his company or his family, his professional legacy or his future with Julia. Night was falling over Vancouver, and with it, the realization that some decisions, once made, have no turning back. Nicholas Parker was about to discover that the price of the truth could be higher than he ever imagined paying. Back in Seattle, Monday arrived with a suffocating intensity. Nicholas had barely slept during the return flight, Marcus Donovan's words echoing in his mind like a dark mantra. The takeover bid was due to expire in less than 24 hours, and the board meeting was scheduled for that morning. The quarterly reports are on your desk, Caroline informed him as soon as he entered the office. And Mr. Bennett has already called 3 times this morning. Nicholas loosened his tie, feeling suffocated. Any news from Julia? She's been in the development lab since early this morning. It seems there's been another breakthrough in the project. He nodded, shutting himself in his office. The reports confirmed his worst fears. Without a significant injection of capital in the next few days, Parker Enterprises would not survive the month. His hands were shaking as he typed an email to Donovan, asking for an extension. The reply came almost instantly. My offer is final. Time is money, Mr. Parker. A soft knock on the door interrupted his gloomy thoughts. Julia entered, radiant as ever, carrying her laptop. I need to show you something incredible, she said, approaching his desk. The algorithm is exceeding all our expectations. The energy companies are going to go crazy when they see it. Nicholas watched as she animatedly explained about codes and energy efficiency, her eyes shining with passion for her work. Her small 4-month belly was more visible under her navy blue dress. Julia, he interrupted softly, we need to talk about the future of the project. She stopped her explanation, frowning. What do you mean? Before he could answer, Caroline rushed in. Mr. Parker, the board is meeting in a conference room. They require your presence immediately. Now is not a good time, began Nicholas, but Caroline's urgent gaze made him hesitate. Is everything all right? Asked Julia, her expression changing from enthusiasm to concern. Just a routine meeting, he lied, getting up. Can we continue this conversation later? At dinner, perhaps? Julia nodded slowly, but Nicholas could tell she wasn't convinced. As he left the room, he felt the weight of her questioning gaze on his back. The conference room was packed. Richard Bennett was standing at the head of the table, his face red with irritation. Parker, We just received a notice from First Union Bank. They're threatening to foreclose on our debt. The world seemed to spin around Nicholas. I have an investment proposal under consideration, he said, his voice firmer than he felt. Donovan Capital? Bennett laughed humorlessly. Yes, we're aware. He contacted us directly. Nicholas felt his blood run cold. What? He offered to buy the company for a considerable sum, on the condition that he had full control over the Rodriguez project. Bennett leaned across the table. It's our only way out, Nicholas. The board has already voted. You can't do that, protested Nicholas. The project belongs to Julia. She has rights to the intellectual property. Actually, not entirely, intervened the company's lawyer, David Mills. Her contract clearly states that any development carried out during her period of employment belongs to Parker Enterprises. Nicholas felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. How had he not noticed this clause before? The vote was unanimous, continued Bennett. You have until tomorrow to finalize the deal with Donovan, or we'll start bankruptcy proceedings. On leaving the meeting, Nicholas found Julia waiting in the hallway. His heart sank when he saw her expression. How long did you intend to keep this from me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Julia, I can explain. Explain what? That the company is going bankrupt? That you're negotiating my project behind my back? Her words were as sharp as blades. I heard everything, Nicholas. The walls aren't that thick. I was trying to protect you, protect the three of us. He tried to move closer, but she backed away. Protect? Julia laughed bitterly, tears starting to form in her eyes. By lying to me? Letting me dream of a future that you knew was falling apart? I was going to tell you. In Vancouver, I tried, but you didn't, she interrupted him. Instead, you kept pretending everything was fine. Meanwhile, you were negotiating my job with investors without my knowledge. The silence that followed was deafening. Employees hurried through the corridor, casting curious glances at the scene that was unfolding. Julia, please, Nicholas begged, his voice breaking. I love you. Everything I've done has been with our future in mind. Love without trust isn't love, Nicholas. She dried a tear with the back of her hand. It's manipulation. With those words, Julia turned and walked towards the elevator, leaving Nicholas standing in the hallway, devastated by the realization that his fears had materialized in the worst possible way. He had lost not only his company, but also the trust of the woman he loved and, possibly, the chance to be a father. The afternoon sun filtered through the hallway windows, creating elongated shadows that seemed to mock his loneliness. Nicholas Parker had built his life on promises of success and stability, but now, as he watched Julia disappear into the elevator, he realized that he had built a house of cards that was finally collapsing around him. Nicholas stared at the screen of his cell phone, rereading for the 10th time the unanswered message he had sent to Julia. Can we talk? Please. The office, once his haven of power and control, now felt like a prison of glass and steel, suffocating him with every passing minute. Caroline entered without knocking, something she only did in extreme situations. Mr. Parker, the development team is in an uproar. Julia has just resigned and downloaded all the project's source code onto her personal computer. What? Nicholas stood up abruptly. She can't do that. The legal department is already preparing an injunction, Caroline continued. Mr. Bennett is furious, and Marcus Donovan is called 3 times in the last 20 minutes. Nicholas grabbed his jacket and ran for the elevator. He knew Julia well enough to know exactly where she would be. In Kerry Park, her favorite place to think when she was upset. Seattle traffic seemed to conspire against him, each red light increasing his anxiety. When he finally reached the park, he found her exactly where he imagined, sitting on one of the benches overlooking the city. Her eyes were red, and she held her laptop as if it were a shield. Julia, he called softly, coming closer. Don't come any closer, she warned, her voice shaky but firm. I've made my decision. I'm not going to let you sell my work to a corporate predator like Marcus Donovan. You don't understand, Nicholas tried to explain, keeping his distance as she asked. If we don't close this deal, the company will go bankrupt. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs. And you think I don't care about that? Julia stood up facing him. But this project isn't just code on a computer. It's something that could really make a difference in the world, reducing energy consumption by up to 60%. In the hands of someone like Donovan, it will be just another tool to increase profits. We can find a middle ground, Nicholas suggested desperately. Maybe if we talk to Donovan together. You still don't get it, do you? Julia shook her head in disappointment. This isn't about the project anymore. It's about trust, about respect, about building something real, not a facade of lies. A cold wind blew between them, carrying dry leaves and broken promises. On the horizon, the Space Needle rose against a gray sky, a silent witness to yet another romance crumbling under the weight of wrong choices. What about our daughter? Nicholas asked, his voice almost a whisper. I can't lose you both. Julia instinctively put a hand on her belly. You'll play your part in her life, Nicholas. But I can no longer trust my heart to someone who chooses lies as a form of protection. Nicholas' cell phone rang. It was Bennett again. He ignored the call, knowing that every second away from the office brought his company closer to the abyss. But for the first time since everything had started to fall apart, his priorities were clear. I'm withdrawing Donovan's offer, he declared, surprising even himself. Even if it means losing everything. It's not about grand gestures now, Julia replied more gently. It's about who you are, who we are, and the example we want to set for our daughter. At that moment, raindrops began to fall, typical of Seattle. Julia put her laptop in her bag and got up to leave. What are you going to do? Asked Nicholas, feeling helpless. I'm going to develop this project my way, with people who share my vision, she replied. I already have a few startups interested in a partnership that respects the original principles of the project. Julia, don't say you love me, she interrupted him. Not now. Words are easy, Nicholas. It's choices that define who we are. She walked away in the increasing rain, leaving Nicholas alone in the park. His cell phone kept vibrating incessantly. The corporate world didn't wait for broken hearts or belated regrets. Back at the office, Nicholas found chaos. Bennett had called an emergency board meeting, and Donovan was threatening to withdraw his offer completely if he didn't receive an answer by the end of the day. Sitting in his chair, Nicholas looked at the photo on his desk. Him and Julia at the project launch party, before everything got complicated. Their smiles were genuine, their hopes intact. Now all that remained were difficult choices and inevitable consequences. Caroline walked in with a stack of documents. The legal department needs your signature to proceed with the lawsuit against Julia. Nicholas looked at the papers, then at the photo again. Somewhere between Vancouver and now, he had lost sight of what really mattered. Maybe it was time to start again, even if it meant losing everything he had built. Cancel the action, he ordered, standing up, and schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. But so, it's time to do the right thing, Caroline, even if it's too late. The rain continued to fall on Seattle, washing away the streets and perhaps offering a chance of redemption for those willing to face their truths, no matter how painful. The press conference was scheduled for 9 in the morning in the lobby of Parker Enterprises. Nicholas had spent the entire night in his office, preparing for what would be the most difficult moment of his career. The first lights of morning penetrated the windows as he mentally rehearsed his speech for the 100th time. Are you sure about this? Asked Caroline, entering the room with a cup of strong coffee. We can still cancel. Nicholas shook his head, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the window. I've done enough damage trying to hide the truth. The lobby was packed when he came down. Journalists, investors, and employees crowded around, murmuring speculations about the surprise announcement. Richard Bennett stood in a corner, his face red with restrained fury after discovering that Nicholas had officially rejected Donovan's proposal. Climbing onto the small, makeshift podium, Nicholas felt the weight of all the cameras and stares on him. His heart was pounding as he adjusted the microphone. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice firmer than he expected. In recent months, Parker Enterprises has faced significant financial challenges that, out of pride and fear, I have chosen to hide from our employees, partners, and the public. A buzz went through the audience. Nicholas saw some employees exchanging worried glances. Our company is on the verge of bankruptcy, he continued, ignoring the flashes of the cameras. We've received a takeover offer that could save us financially, but accepting it would mean compromising the ethical principles that have always guided our mission. At that moment, the doors to the lobby opened and Julia entered discreetly, positioning herself at the back of the room. Their gazes met briefly, and Nicholas felt his resolve strengthen. The Rodriguez Project, our most promising energy efficiency initiative, was developed with the aim of democratizing access to clean energy. To sell this project to purely commercial interests would be to betray not only our values, but also the trust of everyone who believed in our vision. Richard Bennett started to walk towards the podium, but was restrained by other board members. I am therefore announcing today my resignation as CEO of Parker Enterprises, declared Nicholas, provoking a burst of surprised exclamations. In addition, I am transferring my shares in the company to a trust that will be managed by an independent board with the specific mission of preserving our original vision of sustainable technology. The camera flashes intensified and journalists began shouting questions. Nicholas raised his hand, asking for silence. I've made mistakes trying to protect this company through methods that contradict everything we've ever stood for. Today, I choose to fix those mistakes in the only way I know how, with total transparency. His eyes met Julia's again, who remained motionless at the back of the lobby, one hand resting on her growing belly. To all the employees of Parker Enterprises, I apologize for having failed you. To our investors, I take full responsibility for the losses. And to those I trusted personally, his voice faltered slightly, I apologize for having chosen the path of lies when I should have bet on the truth. Chaos ensued in the lobby as soon as Nicholas left the podium. Journalists jostled for statements, officials argued in agitated groups, and Bennett gestured furiously with his phone. Nicholas managed to escape to the private elevator, but before the doors could close, a hand stopped them. Julia entered, her face a mask of contained emotions. "Why did you do that?" she asked as the elevator went up. "Because you were right," he replied, exhausted. "About choices defining who we are, about setting the right example for our daughter." Silence filled the small space between them, laden with unspoken words and complex feelings. "What are you going to do now?" Julia asked softly. "Honestly, I don't know." Nicholas laughed humorlessly. "For the first time in a long time, I don't have a plan." The elevator reached the penthouse, but neither of them made any mention of getting out. Julia bit her lip, hesitating. "I got an invitation to present the project at a sustainable energy conference in Portland next week," she finally said. Maybe you'd like to come? As a consultant?" Nicholas looked at her, surprised. "After everything that's happened?" "You chose to do the right thing today," she replied, meeting his eyes. "Late, but you chose. And our daughter deserves to see that people can learn from their mistakes and start again." The elevator doors opened again, this time on the first floor. The lobby was still a mess, but it seemed distant, as if he and Julia were in a bubble isolated from the world. "Portland?" he asked, a small smile forming on his lips. "Portland," she confirmed, returning the smile shyly. But this time, no secrets. As they walked out of the building, avoiding the press at the back, Nicholas realized that perhaps true success didn't lie in the numbers in a bank account or the value of a company's shares. Perhaps it lay in the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful, and the chance to rebuild something stronger and truer from the ashes of what had been lost. Morning was advancing in Seattle, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but honest. And for now, that was enough. A week after the press conference that shook Seattle's tech market, Nicholas found himself in a small coffee shop in Portland, reviewing his notes for the conference presentation. The Main Street coffee shop had a cozy atmosphere that contrasted dramatically with the corporate offices he was used to. "Your coffee is getting cold," commented Julia, sitting on the other side of the round table. She had arrived early to finalize some details of her presentation, and Nicholas was still amazed at how naturally they worked together again, even if in a different way. "Sorry, I was thinking about the section on gradual implementation of the system," he replied, taking a sip of his already lukewarm coffee. "I think we can strengthen that point." Julia nodded, her fingers drumming gently on her own cup. The silence between them still carried the weight of recent events. But there was also something new, a raw honesty that made every interaction more meaningful. "I got an interesting call this morning," said Julia, breaking the silence. "The Green Future Foundation is interested in funding the project. No corporate interference, just pure sustainable development." Nicholas looked up from his notes in surprise. Green Future was known for its rigorous selection process and commitment to ethical innovation. "That's amazing, Julia. They rarely fund early-stage projects." "Actually," she hesitated, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear, "they specifically mentioned your decision at Parker Enterprises as a deciding factor. Apparently, integrity still has some value in Silicon Valley." The irony in her voice was soft, almost playful, making Nicholas smile for the first time in days. Before he could reply, his phone vibrated with a message from Caroline. "Richard Bennett has accepted your restructuring proposal," he read aloud, hardly believing the words. "The independent board will be established by the end of the month." Julia reached across the table, lightly touching his fingers. "You did the right thing, Nicholas, even if it took me a while to realize it." Her touch sent an electric current through his body, reminding him of all the moments they had shared before everything fell apart. Before he could reply, the cafe door opened, and a gust of autumn wind brought Ashley Monroe, the Green Future representative, into the establishment. "Julia, Nicholas," she called, approaching with energetic steps. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," Julia replied, discreetly withdrawing her hand. "We were just going over a few points for tomorrow's presentation." Ashley sat down with them, her eyes shining with genuine enthusiasm. "I can't wait to see the project in action. But first, I wanted to discuss some ideas about the development framework the Foundation proposes." Over the next hour, they immersed themselves in a detailed discussion about the future of the project. Nicholas watched in amazement as Julia explained her vision with passion and technical precision, occasionally contributing insights into implementation and scalability. "One last thing," said Ashley, preparing to leave. "The Foundation would like you two to lead the project." As a team, the cafe suddenly became very quiet. Nicholas looked at Julia, whose eyes widened slightly at the proposal. She began, but Ashley interrupted her. "No pressure to decide now. Just consider it. Your complementary skills are exactly what we need to make this work on a large scale." After Ashley left, the silence returned, heavier this time. Nicholas watched Julia play with the rim of her empty glass, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to accept it," he said finally. "I completely understand if you prefer to go it alone." Julia raised her eyes, meeting his. "You really have changed, haven't you?" "I'm trying," he replied honestly. "Every day is a learning experience about what really matters." A small smile played on her lips. "The conference starts tomorrow. How about we concentrate on that first, and then we could talk about the future?" Nicholas nodded, feeling a pang of hope in his chest. As they gathered their belongings to leave, Julia stopped suddenly, putting a hand to her stomach. "Is everything all right?" he asked, concerned. "She's kicking," Julia replied softly. Without thinking, she took Nicholas' hand and placed it on her stomach. "Here, do you feel it?" The moment was so intimate, so precious, that Nicholas hardly dared to breathe. Under his fingers, he felt the gentle movement of his daughter, and his eyes filled with tears. "I think she approves of the idea of us working together," Julia joked, her voice tinged with emotion. Leaving the cafe, they walked side by side through the streets of Portland, chatting about the next day's performance and occasionally exchanging glances full of unspoken possibilities. The autumn sun painted the city in golden hues, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Nicholas felt that maybe, just maybe, some things needed to be completely destroyed in order to be rebuilt in a stronger, truer way. Night fell over Portland, and with it came the promise of a new dawn. Nicholas Parker had lost an empire built on lies, but there, walking alongside Julia through the city's illuminated streets, he was beginning to glimpse something much more valuable: the chance to build something real, something honest, something that would last much longer than any material fortune. The Sustainable Energy Conference in Portland was packed when Julia took the stage at the Oregon Convention Center. Nicholas watched from the front row, admiring how naturally she commanded the audience's attention. even though her 5-month belly was already visible under her professional black dress. The future of sustainable energy can't just be about profits, Julia began, her firm voice echoing through the auditorium. It needs to be about affordability, about democratizing access to clean energy. As she presented the project's technical data, Nicholas noticed Ashley Monroe from the Green Future Foundation furiously taking notes. Next to him, several representatives of other environmental organizations were showing equal interest. And now, Julia paused dramatically. I'd like to invite Nicholas Parker to demonstrate the practical applications of the system. Nicholas' heart raced as he took to the stage. It was the first time they had appeared publicly together since the Parker Enterprises scandal. The whispers in the audience were audible, but he kept his focus on Julia, who handed him control of the presentation with a small, encouraging smile. As many of you know, he began, his voice huskier than usual, I've recently learned that success can't just be measured in dollars. The real impact comes from the change we can create in the world. For the next hour, they worked in perfect sync, filling in each other's ideas, answering complex questions, and demonstrating how the system could drastically reduce energy consumption in urban areas. The chemistry between them was palpable, reminiscent of the simpler times at Parker Enterprises. After the presentation, they were surrounded by a crowd of interested people. Ashley approached with a beaming smile. That was extraordinary, she exclaimed. The foundation wants to set up a formal meeting for tomorrow. We can discuss numbers and organizational structure. Tomorrow. Julia seemed to hesitate, her hand unconsciously resting on her belly. I have a prenatal appointment, Nicholas explained, surprising both Julia and himself by remembering. But can we do a late lunch? Ashley agreed enthusiastically, stepping aside to make the necessary coordinations. Julia looked at Nicholas with a soft expression. You remembered the appointment, she said, almost whispering. Of course I did, he replied, resisting the urge to touch her face. It's our daughter. Before they could continue their conversation, they were interrupted by more people wanting to discuss the project. When they finally got a moment of privacy, it was late afternoon. I need to sit down, Julia admitted, looking exhausted. My back is killing me. Nicholas guided her to a cafe near the convention center, ordering chamomile tea for her and a coffee for himself. The establishment had a cozy atmosphere, with large windows that let in the golden evening light. You were amazing today, he said, watching her gently blow on the hot tea. We were amazing, she corrected, meeting his eyes. We've always worked well together, Nicholas. That's never been our problem. The weight of that truth hung between them. Nicholas played with his napkin, gathering his courage for what he needed to say. Julia, about Green Future's proposal. If you want to lead the project on your own, I completely understand. I don't want you to feel any pressure because of our history. She was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Do you know what hurt me the most? She finally asked. It wasn't so much the lie about the company. It was that you didn't trust me enough to share your fears, your doubts. I wanted to be strong for you, for us, he confessed. But I learned the hard way that true strength lies in being vulnerable, in admitting when you need help. And now, she asked, her voice soft, what's changed? Nicholas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that moment. Now I know that I don't need to have all the answers, that it's okay to build something new, even when the future is uncertain. That trust is not a sign of weakness, but of courage. Julia reached across the table, lightly touching her fingers. Green Future wants an answer by tomorrow after the meeting. And what do you want? He asked, his heart racing at her touch. I want to build something meaningful, she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. Something our daughter can be proud of one day. And, honestly, I can't imagine doing that without you. The sun was setting over Portland, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. To the cafe windows, the world seemed softer, more full of possibilities. So let's build together, said Nicholas, entwining his fingers with hers. One step at a time, with total honesty. Julia squeezed his hand gently. One step at a time, she agreed. By the time they left the cafe, night had fallen over the city. Nicholas insisted on accompanying Julia to her hotel, and as they walked side by side to the brightly lit streets of Portland, chatting about the next day's appointment and the plan for the project. They both felt that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right track to rebuilding not only a sustainable energy project, but also the trust they have lost. The waiting room of the medical clinic in Portland had a welcoming air, with its softly toned walls and photographs of smiling babies. Nicholas was distractedly leafing through a parenting magazine, while Julia was filling in forms at the reception desk. The normality of the scene contrasted with the complexity of their situation. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" called the nurse, smiling gently. "Dr. Harrison is ready to see you." Julia hesitated for a moment, looking at Nicholas. "Do you want?" "Only if you want to," he replied quickly, trying to mask his anxiety. "I want to," she said softly, and that single word carried the weight of all the changes that had been happening between them. Dr. Harrison was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes in a maternal air. As she prepared the ultrasound equipment, she asked routine questions about the pregnancy, creating a relaxed atmosphere in the office. "So, do you want to know more details about the sex of the baby?" asked the doctor, applying the gel to Julia's belly. "We already know it's a girl," replied Julia, her hand unconsciously searching for Nicholas's, which was next to the gurney. "But we want to make sure everything's okay." The sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room, strong and rhythmic. Nicholas felt his own eyes fill with tears as he watched the tiny shape on the screen, now much more defined than the last time he had seen it. "She's perfectly healthy," confirmed Dr. Harrison, moving the transducer to show different angles. "And yes, definitely a girl. Had he thought about names?" The silence that followed was revealing. Between project presentations and negotiations with Green Future, they hadn't discussed something as fundamental as the name of their daughter. "We're still talking about it," Nicholas replied diplomatically. After the consultation, they walked together to a small park near the clinic. The fresh Portland air carried the scent of pine trees, and the morning sun created dancing patterns through the leaves. "How about Isabella?" suggested Julia suddenly, sitting down on a bench. "Isabella." Nicholas considered the name, taking a seat next to her. "It's pretty. Does it have any special meaning?" "It was my grandmother's name," she explained, her eyes lost in memories. "She taught me that strength lies not in never falling, but in always getting up." Nicholas absorbed her words, thinking of his own falls and attempts at redemption. "Isabella Parker Rodriguez," he said, testing how it sounded. "It's perfect." Julia smiled, but her countenance soon turned serious. "About the meeting with Green Future, we can postpone it if you're not feeling well," Nicholas offered quickly. "It's not that," she shook her head. "It's just that we need to set some clear boundaries if we're going to work together again, professionally and personally." Nicholas straightened up in his seat, feeling the weight of the conversation. "I'm listening. First, total transparency, not just about the project, but about everything that might affect it. Secondly, important decisions need to be made together. And third," she paused, taking a deep breath, "we need to be honest about our feelings." "Julia," Nicholas began, his heart racing. "Not now," she interrupted him gently. "I'm not ready for that particular conversation yet. But I promise that when I am, you'll be the first to know." He nodded, respecting her boundaries. "I accept all your conditions. And I'll add one. I promise never again to let fear or pride override the truth." Julia's cell phone vibrated. It was Ashley confirming her lunch date. The reality of the outside world was invading her moment of intimacy. "We should go and get ready for the meeting," said Julia, standing up carefully. Nicholas immediately offered his arm for support, a gesture she accepted with a small smile. As they walked back, Nicholas realized that perhaps this was the real reconstruction, not just of a professional project, but of trust, of mutual respect, of small moments of shared vulnerability. "Isabella," he murmured again, savoring his daughter's name. "I think she'll teach us a lot about new beginnings." Julia squeezed his arm lightly in response, and in that simple gesture there was more hope than in all the words they could have said. The Portland sun shone down on them, promising not just a new day, but a new chapter in their lives. A chapter written with honesty, built on stronger foundations than the previous ones, and illuminated by the promise of a small miracle called Isabella. The city around them continued its frenetic pace, but there, at that moment, Time seemed kinder, more patient, as if it understood that some stories need to be rewritten carefully, page by page, truth by truth. The meeting room of the Green Future Foundation in Portland emanated a different atmosphere from the corporate environments Nicholas was used to. The walls displayed photographs of sustainable projects around the world, and a large recycled wood table reflected the organization's mission. Ashley Monroe enthusiastically led the presentation while Julia and Nicholas shared a look of mutual understanding. The foundation's proposal was more than generous. Full funding, creative autonomy, and an organizational structure that would allow the project to maintain its original integrity. So, Ashley concluded, "What do you think?" Nicholas watched Julia organize her thoughts, recognizing that little gestures she made with her hands when she was about to make an important decision. "Before we answer," Julia began, her voice firm, "we'd like to propose some modifications to the agreement." The next 2 hours were dedicated to intense negotiation. Julia insisted on a clause that would guarantee that part of future profits would go towards implementing the system in low-income communities. Nicholas, for his part, suggested the creation of an advisory board that would include sustainability experts and community representatives. "You've really thought of everything," commented Ashley, visibly impressed. "It's refreshing to see people who are as committed to the social impact as they are to the success of the project." When they finally signed the preliminary documents, the sun was already beginning to set over Portland. Nicholas felt a weight being lifted off his shoulders, not by the financial security the agreement provided, but by the certainty that they were doing the right thing. "We need to celebrate," Ashley declared, putting the documents away in his briefcase. "How about dinner? I know a great vegetarian restaurant nearby." Julia gently touched her belly. "Actually, Isabella is asking for Thai food. It's been her constant craving this week." "Isabella?" asked Ashley, smiling. "Our daughter," replied Nicholas, feeling a surge of pride as he used those words. "We decided on a name this morning. The Thai restaurant they chose was a cozy spot in the Pearl District with colorful lanterns and the scent of spices in the air." While Ashley shared stories about the foundation's other projects, Nicholas watched Julia discreetly, noticing how she seemed more relaxed, more at peace. "So, when do you plan to start the move to Portland?" asked Ashley between mouthfuls of pad thai. Nicholas and Julia exchanged surprised glances. "Moving?" they asked in unison. "Oh, sorry, I thought it was clear in the contract." Ashley looked genuinely embarrassed. "The development center will be based here in Portland. I thought you would have noticed that part." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Moving to Portland would mean leaving Seattle, their established lives, their routines. But it would also mean a fresh start, away from the shadows of the past. "I need to use the restroom," Julia said abruptly, standing up carefully. Nicholas watched her walk away, recognizing in her tense shoulders the weight of the decision they would have to make. "You know," Ashley commented softly, "sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as great changes." When Julia returned, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the question of moving hung over them like a cloud laden with possibilities and uncertainties. After dinner, Nicholas insisted on accompanying Julia to her hotel. The Portland night air was pleasantly cool, and the streets of the Pearl District glowed with the lights of the restaurants and galleries. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing her contemplative silence. "About how unpredictable life is," she replied, pausing to look in a shop window. "A few months ago, I had everything planned out. My career in Seattle, my apartment in Queen, and now I'm pregnant, potentially moving to another city, starting a completely new project." "Afraid?" asked Nicholas softly. "Curiously, no," she smiled, turning to him. "Maybe it's Isabella teaching me that sometimes we need to trust the unknown." Nicholas felt his heart race with the vulnerability of that moment. "Julia, about Portland, we don't have to decide now," she interrupted him gently. "We have time, and this time, we'll make all the important decisions together, remember?" He nodded, respecting the space she was establishing. When they arrived at the hotel, Julia hesitated before entering. "Tomorrow is my last day in Portland," she said. "I thought I'd check out a few neighborhoods, just to get an idea. Would you like some company?" offered Nicholas, trying not to sound too eager. "I do," she replied with a small smile. "And maybe we could look for a baby store?" Isabella will need a closet suitable for the Portland climate if we decide to come. It's a date then, Nicholas said, and immediately corrected himself. I mean an outing, a field trip. Julia laughed, the musical sound of her laughter echoing in the night. Good night, Nicholas. As he walked back to his own hotel, Nicholas reflected on how life had curious ways of opening up new paths. Portland, with its tree-lined streets and quirky culture, was beginning to seem less like a strange place and more like a possibility for a fresh start. His phone vibrated with a message from Julia. Isabella is kicking like crazy. I think she liked Portland. Nicholas smiled at the screen, feeling that familiar mixture of love and hope that Julia and her daughter aroused in him. Maybe Ashley was right. Maybe the greatest gifts really did come disguised as great changes. The night embraced Portland with its characteristic softness, and in the city's illuminated streets, two hearts began to consider the possibility of building not just a project, but a home together. The sound of Nicholas and Julia's footsteps echoed through the streets of Portland's Nob Hill neighborhood, where colorful Victorian houses lined tree-lined streets. It was their last day in the city, and the decision to move hung over them like a cloud laden with possibilities. This place reminds me a lot of Queen Anne, commented Julia, stopping to admire a blue house with white details. But there's something different about it. More welcoming, perhaps. Nicholas watched as she unconsciously stroked her belly while observing the children playing in a small park nearby. Isabella seemed more active today, as if she also wanted to take part in exploring the city. There's a famous coffee shop just around the corner, he said, checking his phone. They say they make the best chai latte in town. The interior of the cafe was cozy, with bookshelves covering the walls and plants hanging from the ceiling. While they waited for their orders, Julia leafed through a local guide to Portland that she had found on one of the shelves. Did you know that Portland has the highest number of urban parks per capita in the United States? She commented, her eyes sparkling with interest. And get this, there's an organic farmer's market every Saturday at Park Blocks. I can see you buying organic vegetables for Isabella there, joked Nicholas, but there was a note of seriousness in his voice. Julia closed the guide, looking at him with a thoughtful expression. We're really considering this, are we? Changing our lives completely. Does it scare you? He asked softly. Honestly, less than it should, she replied after a moment. Maybe because, well, our lives have already changed so much in the last few months. A change of city seems almost small in comparison. The barista called their names, and Nicholas went to take their orders, giving Julia a moment to organize her thoughts. When she returned, she was looking out of the window, watching the street go by. There's a baby store 2 blocks from here, he mentioned, placing the chai latte in front of her. Would you like to take a look? The store was small but charming, specializing in sustainable baby products. Julia immediately fell in love with an organic jumpsuit with little trees printed on it. It's so Portland, she laughed, holding it against her belly. Nicholas watched as she browsed the shelves, occasionally stopping to touch a fabric or examine an educational toy. It was the first time he had seen her so relaxed since discovering her pregnancy. Nicholas, she called suddenly, her voice serious. If we came here, what would it be like? He moved closer, choosing his words carefully. Well, we could run a place first, maybe in Nob Hill or the Pearl District. Get to know the city better before making more permanent decisions. What about the project? Green Future offered all the necessary support. We would have total creative freedom and adequate resources. Most importantly, we could keep the original vision of the project intact. Julia nodded slowly, still holding the jumpsuit. What about us? What would that be like? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. Nicholas felt his heart racing. One day at a time, he answered honestly. No pressure, no expectations other than the ones we set together. Just building something real. Something real, she repeated softly. Then, with decision, she walked over to the cashier with the overalls. I'll take this one. Whatever we decide, Isabella will need clothes anyway. They left the store and continued walking, now towards Washington Park. The afternoon sun created golden patterns through the trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses from the park's famous garden. Do you know what I like most about Portland? asked Julia, taking a seat on a bench overlooking the city. "How everything seems possible here, as if we could really start again without the weight of the past." Nicholas sat down next to her, allowing their shoulders to touch lightly. "Julia, I want you to know that whatever we decide about Portland, my commitment to you and Isabella doesn't change. If you'd rather stay in Seattle—" "Nicholas," she interrupted him, turning to face him. "I think I've made my decision." He held his breath, waiting. "I want to come to Portland," she declared. "Not just for the project, but for everything this city represents. A chance to build something new, something of our own from scratch." "Are you sure?" he asked, his heart pounding. In response, Julia took his hand and placed it on her stomach, where Isabella was kicking energetically. "I think she's made up her mind too," she smiled. Nicholas felt tears forming in his eyes. "Then let's do it. Let's build our history here." The sun was beginning to set over Portland, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. There was still much to be decided, much to be planned, but at that moment, sitting on that bench in Washington Park, with Isabella dancing under their joined hands, everything seemed possible. The city stretched out before them, no longer as a stranger, but as a new beginning. A place where they could plant roots and, at the same time, give wings to their dreams. A place where they could be not just Nicholas and Julia, but a family. Nicholas' office in Seattle seemed smaller as he packed his belongings in cardboard boxes. 3 weeks had passed since the decision to move to Portland, and the reality of the transition was beginning to take concrete shape. "Your lawyer is online too," Caroline announced over the intercom. "Something about finalizing the Parker Enterprises documents." Nicholas sighed, staring at a framed photo of their first headquarters, a small office in downtown Seattle, where it had all begun. He answered the phone as he continued organizing his memories into boxes. "The buyers want to bring forward the transfer," informed David Mills, his lawyer. "They're offering a considerable bonus to close this week." "What about the employees?" asked Nicholas, his main concern since deciding to sell the company to a group of investors who had promised to keep most of the jobs. "All the agreements have been kept as agreed," assured Mills. "Caroline has even accepted the offer to continue as managing director." The news brought some relief. Caroline had been more than an assistant over the last few years. She had been a confidant and often her corporate conscience. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from Julia. "I just saw a perfect apartment in Northwest Portland. 3 bedrooms, balcony, 2 blocks from the park. Can I arrange a virtual tour for you?" An involuntary smile appeared on his face as he replied in the affirmative. Julia had flown to Portland 2 days earlier to begin her search for a place to live, insisting that she needed to feel the energy of the neighborhoods in person. "Nicholas?" Mill's voice brought him back to reality. "I need your decision on the down payment." "Schedule the signing for Thursday," he replied decisively. "The sooner we close this chapter, the better." After hanging up, Nicholas continued his task of emptying the office. Each object held a story. The paperweight he had won from his first client, the pen he had used to sign his biggest contract, the Businessman of the Year plaque that now seemed to belong to another life. Caroline entered without knocking, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need a break," she offered, taking a seat in a chair opposite his desk. "I'm going to miss your coffee," Nicholas admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "And I'll miss making coffee for someone who really appreciates it," she replied with a nostalgic smile. "But you're doing the right thing, you know, choosing family." Nicholas nodded, allowing her words to comfort him. "Still, sometimes I wonder if I'm being crazy, abandoning everything I've built here." "You're not abandoning," Caroline corrected. "You're choosing to build something new, something more important." Her phone rang again. It was Julia, excited to show her the apartment via a video call. The place was exactly as she had described it, spacious, bright, with a partial view of the mountains. "The master bedroom has a walk-in closet perfect for all those little outfits we bought for Isabella," Julia explained, turning the camera to show the room. "And there's a home office area that we can turn into a shared workspace." "It's perfect," agreed Nicholas, noticing how naturally she was already talking about a future together. "Do you want me to call the real estate agency now?" "Actually," Julia hesitated, biting her lip in a familiar way. "I've kind of already signed the contract. I know we agreed to decide everything together, but this place is exactly what we were looking for, and there were other people interested." Julia, Nicholas interrupted, smiling. You've done well. I trust your judgment. The relief on her face was visible even through the cell phone screen. There's one more thing, Ashley called. He wants to start the planning meetings next week. Do you think you could be here by then? Nicholas looked around the half-empty office at the boxes containing a decade of his professional life. I'm signing the final sale documents on Thursday. I could be in Portland on Friday night. Good, smiled Julia, because I've already arranged a dinner with Ashley and some of the team for Saturday. And she paused dramatically. I have a prenatal appointment on Monday. I thought you might want to be there. I wouldn't miss it for the world, he assured her, feeling that familiar wave of emotion that accompanied him whenever he thought of Isabella. After hanging up, Nicholas returned to the task of organizing his things, but now with renewed purpose. Each object he kept no longer represented an end, but a transition to something greater. Caroline returned at the end of the day, finding him still immersed in memories and documents. Do you need help finishing? Actually, he replied, looking at the last box. I think I'm done. The rest can go in the company archive. So, is this really the last night of Seattle businessman Nicholas Parker? She asked, a touch of emotion in her voice. It's the last night of the old Nicholas Parker, he corrected, standing up to watch the sun set over the city that had been his home for so long. The new one is still being written in Portland. The sun was setting over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, like a fitting farewell to the end of an era. Somewhere to the south, in Portland, an empty apartment was waiting to become a home, and a new life was being woven with threads of hope, trust, and second chances. The move to Portland took place on a rainy Thursday, typical of the Pacific Northwest. Nicholas watched the movers transport the last boxes to the new apartment in Northwest Portland, while Julia methodically organized the kitchen, stopping occasionally to rest her back now that her pregnancy was entering its 6th month. The crib arrives tomorrow, she reported, jotting something down on her tablet. And the Green Future team confirmed the meeting for Monday. Ashley wants a full tour of the new office. Nicholas nodded, still absorbing the reality of his new life. The sale of Parker Enterprises had been finalized the previous week, a bittersweet process that marked the definitive end of an era. Now, watching Julia in her new kitchen, planning their future together, it all seemed as distant as a dream. We need to decide on the color of Isabella's room, Julia commented, interrupting her thoughts. I was thinking of a soft sage green. It suits Portland, don't you think? Sage? Nicholas raised an eyebrow, teasing her. I thought you were going to suggest pink like all the other mothers. Julia laughed, approaching him with a determined expression. Our daughter won't be limited by color conventions, Mr. Parker. Besides, she paused dramatically, sage promotes tranquility and connection with nature. You've been researching color psychology, haven't you? Nicholas smiled, enveloping her in a gentle hug. The moment was interrupted by the doorbell. It was Ashley, carrying a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling wine and a small package wrapped in craft paper. Welcome gift, she announced, handing the package to Julia. For Portland's newest resident. Julia carefully opened the gift, revealing an old book on the history of Portland and a set of keys. The keys are to the new office, Ashley explained excitedly. I thought you might like to take a look before the official meeting on Monday. The new workspace was in a restored historic building in the Pearl District, just a few blocks away from the apartment. Ashley guided them through the modern but welcoming environments, explaining how each area had been designed to promote collaboration and creativity. And this, she said, opening a door at the end of the corridor, will be your office. The room was large, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. 2 complimentary work desks were positioned to allow both privacy and easy interaction. There's even a space for a crib or playpen, observed Julia, touching a more private area of the office, for when we need to bring Isabella in. Nicholas felt his heart squeeze at that simple comment. This was exactly how he envisioned his future, balancing professional and personal life, with Julia and Isabella always close by. Oh, I almost forgot. Ashley took an envelope from a briefcase. The final contract for Green Future. All the modifications you requested have been included, especially about the fund for implementation in underprivileged communities. While Julia reviewed the documents with Ashley, Nicholas walked to the window, watching the movement in the streets below. Portland pulsed with a different energy from Seattle, more relaxed, more focused on quality of life than corporate success. "Everything is perfect," Julia finally declared, signing her copy of the contract. Nicholas did the same, feeling the symbolic weight of that moment. "Welcome officially to the Green Future family," smiled Ashley, putting the documents away. "Now, how about that sparkling wine?" Back at the apartment, after Ashley had left, Nicholas found Julia on the balcony, contemplating the sunset over the distant mountains. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, offering her a cup of chamomile tea. "About how funny life is," she replied, accepting the drink. "A few months ago, when I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified about the future. Now I feel like everything is exactly where it should be." Nicholas gently touched her belly, feeling Isabella move under his fingers. "Do you think we made the right choice? Coming to Portland?" Julia turned to face him, her eyes shining with certainty. "I think for the first time we're making choices with something bigger than ourselves in mind, and that makes all the difference." The sun continued its downward path, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise a tomorrow full of possibilities. Nicholas knew that there would still be challenges ahead, adapting to a new city, giving birth to Isabella, developing the project. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing these challenges alone. "Sage is a great color for her room," he finally said, making Julia laugh. "I knew you'd agree," she replied, interlacing her fingers with his. "Now I just have to convince you about the wallpaper with little trees that I found." Night fell over Portland, enveloping the city in a blanket of serenity. In their apartment in Northwest, two people who had learned the hard way the value of honesty and trust were planning their future, one detail at a time, building not just a home, but a life together. The Green Future Foundation office in Portland was bustling that Thursday morning. Julia, now 8 months pregnant, was giving a presentation on the first results of the energy efficiency project, her voice conveying the confidence of someone who had completely mastered the subject. Nicholas watched from the back of the room, admiring how she managed to keep everyone's attention, even with Isabella's seemingly determined to do a series of somersaults inside her belly. 2 months had passed since the move to Portland, and each day seemed to confirm that they had made the right choice. Initial tests show a 15% greater reduction in energy consumption than our original projections, Julia explained, moving on to the next slide. "With full implementation of the system, she stopped abruptly, putting a hand to her stomach. Nicholas immediately straightened up in his chair, alert. "Julia," called Ashley, noticing his tense expression. "I'm fine," she replied, taking a deep breath. "Just a contraction. Isabella's been very agitated today." But 10 minutes later, when another contraction made her pause again in the middle of an explanation, it was clear that something else was going on. "I think we need to go to the hospital," declared Nicholas, already grabbing his things. "Ashley, go," interrupted Ashley, taking control of the situation. "Keep us informed." The drive to Oregon Health and Science University Hospital was tense, with Julia alternating between moments of calm and increasingly frequent contractions. "It's still 2 weeks away," she murmured, squeezing Nicholas' hand as they crossed the hospital parking lot. "Her room isn't even completely ready. The wallpaper with the trees is already there," Nicholas reminded her softly, trying to distract her. "And all those sage robes you picked out are organized by size." Dr. Harrison, who had happily agreed to transfer her prenatal care from Seattle to Portland, was already waiting for them in the maternity ward. "Looks like Isabella decided it was time to meet Portland," she smiled, examining Julia. "You're in active labor, honey. Let's get everything ready." The next few hours were a roller coaster of emotions. Nicholas stayed by Julia's side the whole time, offering support, suffering with every contraction, marveling at her strength. "Remember that night in Vancouver?" asked Julia during a moment's pause between contractions. "When you said you wanted to be the father Isabella deserves?" Nicholas nodded, unable to speak because of the emotion. "You already are," she continued, her eyes shining with tears and love. "From the moment you chose the truth over comfort, from the moment you decided to rebuild everything from scratch." Another contraction interrupted her, stronger than the previous ones. Dr. Harrison returned for another examination. "It's time," she announced. Julia, In the next contraction, I want you to push. The world seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. Nicholas felt every second like an eternity as he held Julia's hand, whispering words of encouragement, feeling his own heart beat out of rhythm with her every effort. And then, at 3:47 p.m. on that rainy Portland Thursday, Isabella Parker Rodriguez came into the world with a loud cry that filled the delivery room. "She's perfect," declared Dr. Harrison, placing the little bundle on Julia's chest. "Congratulations, Mom and Dad." Nicholas watched in amazement as Julia held her daughter for the first time. Isabella had a surprising amount of dark hair like her mother's, and when she briefly opened her eyes, she revealed the same shade of blue as his. "Our little one," whispered Julia, her voice tinged with emotion. "We've been waiting for you." "Welcome to the world, Isabella," added Nicholas, gently touching his daughter's small hand, which immediately grasped his finger with surprising strength. Later, when Julia finally fell asleep after the exhaustion of childbirth, Nicholas sat in the armchair next to the hospital crib, watching Isabella sleep. Through the bedroom window, he could see the lights of Portland beginning to glow against the evening sky. Her phone vibrated silently. It was a message from Ashley with a photo of the Green Future team holding a "Welcome, Isabella" sign. Soon after, another message arrived, this time from Caroline in Seattle, anxiously asking for news. "Your world is full of people who already love you," Nicholas whispered to his sleeping daughter. "And I promise I will spend every day of my life making sure you know the value of truth, courage, and unconditional love." Julia stirred in bed, slowly opening her eyes. "Is she still asleep? Like a little angel," replied Nicholas, getting up to sit on the edge of the bed. "Thank you." "For what?" "For giving me a second chance. For trusting me again. For this family." Julia smiled, still sleepy. "You know what's funny? When I found out I was pregnant, I thought my life was falling apart. But in fact, it was just beginning." Nicholas leaned over to kiss her forehead softly. "Our fresh start in Portland." "Our fresh start as a family," she corrected. Isabella chose that moment to wake up, her little face contorting before she let out a soft cry that was soon soothed in Julia's arms. Night fell over Portland, enveloping the city in its dark cloak dotted with lights. In the hospital room, a new family was beginning its journey, built on foundations of truth, trust, and renewed love. Nicholas Parker watched his daughter in Julia's arms, knowing that all the choices, all the changes, all the new beginnings have led to exactly this moment, the true beginning of everything.